So as you heard, I have a philosophical background, and it's not exactly the same as a poetry writer. So I'm looking more into what language models are doing and how they change meaning, what they do with meaning. So a little theoretical background, but I try to make this applicable to poetry writing and novel writing as well, because I think there is a lot of parallels between the work philosophers are doing and you are doing here. So I argue for these claims that large language models work on the level of what I call cotext and not context, and that cotext is not enough for authorship. I'll explain what that means. And then I'll explain that authors create new context, which opens up a new horizon of meaning. And this is something that is not reducible to cotexts. So large language models can be used, I think, to undermine authorship. There's a real problem if we use them, as many people use them just to produce text and to publish that, for instance. But I think there's also a way we can use large language models to support actually authorship. But we need to understand better what authorship is. So I'm going back to work we did before at a workshop in Berlin in Germany, which I co-organized on large language models and the patterns of human language use. You see these different patterns up there, the colors. Those are words for us that make sense to us. They have a sound even. We have an impression of the meaning and even the sound of those words. There's something experiential and there is a meaning to this. For large language models, these are just tokens. So tokens are the smallest units of a large language model. So basically like an alphabet for us. So actually for them, it's only numbers. And they can find patterns in the numbers we cannot see easily. So this one we cannot see easily the pattern. If we write it like this, we can get a visual experience of that one pattern in that text. Large language models work with multidimensional patterns that are like incredibly complex, which humans possibly couldn't follow up on. So this is on the technical background of that. We had a number of talks, one by David Gunkel, on this question, does writing have a future? And he connects to something that we heard yesterday on Roland Barthes' idea of the death of the author. And he thinks that large language models as well speak in favor of a kind of death of the author. I want to put this more into context. So his article that came from this conference is, does writing have a future? And there he writes that large language models and generative AI do not threaten writing, the figure of the author, or the concept of truth. They only threaten a particular and limited conceptualization of authorship and these other things. So what kind of conceptualization of authorship do they contradict, according to Gunkel? So he thinks that this is the misguided concept of authorship, where there's an author who writes a book and puts her thoughts into the book, and then there's a reader who then reads the letters and gets to the text of the book, to the ideas behind that, to the mind of the author. This conception, I think everybody has heard it. It is very prevalent. I found a similar one in Ferdinand de Saussure, the founder of linguistic thought, basically, who believes that there is, in language, there is thought from the one mind put into words and transmitted through space into the ears and then the head of the other person. So a typical view on communication here we find. For Gunkel, of course, it's mediated through text in a book. But what he thinks what really happens is something very different. So he thinks that yes, there's a reader, and the reader reads the text, but whether there's an author or not, that doesn't really matter here, right? The author could be a projection. It could be just, well, a large language model. That could work as well. So here the idea is the author is not necessary to make sense out of the text. And this idea has been put forward in different ways. For instance, there's another article in the same issue, online open access, you can access it easily, by Elena Esposito, and she argues that we can communicate with artificial intelligence even though artificial intelligence cannot understand, which is kind of interesting, right? But she goes back to Nikolaus Luhmann, the German philosopher, who thinks that really it's up to the reader. So it's not just the French tradition, also in Germany there have been similar ideas around that really we need to look at the reader and not so much on the author. So what does Gankl make of this? He writes that the dictionary provides what is perhaps one of the best illustrations of this basic semiotic principle. Words come to have meaning through their differential relationship to other words. And he thinks that this is exactly what Derrida was saying when he said there's nothing outside the text. And in addition, it's exactly what large language models are doing, right? There's literally says nothing outside the text on which they have been trained. So this idea, he kind of stops short of saying, like, this is where meaning arises from. But this idea has been around in semantic theory that wasn't as big traditionally, but which was, or kind of got some vindication or impulse from large language models now. And that's the theory of distributional semantics. Distributional semantics thinks that really the meaning of words depends on that relationship to other words. So the dictionary, basically, right? The words in the dictionary have all relations to each other. To make this a little bit more intuitive, there's a computer linguist who writes on the concept of Shehnai. If I held an Indian Shehnai, I would have a reasonable idea of the meaning of the word. But I would have a richer meaning if I also heard one being played. Does somebody know what a Shehnai is? Sorry? No? No? Well, you got some idea already right now, right? You already got the idea it's like an instrument. It's being played. So Shehnai sounds maybe Indian. Maybe it's there. We could understand a little bit more of that word. He says, if I've never seen, felt, or heard a Shehnai, but somebody tells me that it's like a traditional Indian oboe, then the word has some meaning for me, right? You know what's an oboe, you know it's Indian, it's traditional. Yeah, maybe you can get some more ideas when you look into a dictionary. So using this definition, whereby one understands meaning, consists of understanding networks of connections of linguistic forms, many things, there can be no doubt that pre-trained language models learn meanings. So he thinks that large language models too learn from this idea, this merely formal idea that would be in a dictionary when we get to know, okay, this is an Indian oboe. Maybe we get to know it's played in the context of marriage ceremonies and so on. But of course, you could also see the instrument and get an idea from that. Or you could hear it being played. Okay, for us it's a strange sound, maybe. Maybe not everybody likes it in our culture, but you get a better idea of what a Chennai is from all these different parts. So the idea here is that really a Chennai you can learn a little more through different senses, but also through the meaning in the dictionary. Really, meaning is distributed. And this connects to the idea that meaning is use. So for Wittgenstein, he says that for a large class of cases of the employment of the word meaning, he's pretty careful formulating this. The word can be explained in this way. The meaning of a word is its use in a language. So what Manning believes and distributional semantics believes is that the meaning derives from use in a language. They accord with Wittgenstein, but they think that only knowing the dictionary meaning, only having access to how the word is used in relation to other words in the text corpus would be already enough to learn some of the meaning of the word. You could learn something just by reading it, so they think a machine can also learn something by just knowing the relations between those words. And I think this is a reductive view on this idea of Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein thought of use in a language that entails many things. And there is a question, can be just by learning the relationships between words without knowing anything else. Is that sufficient for language? Or do we at least have some other forms of interactions to make sense of the word? I argue for this latter position, that really we wouldn't learn anything just from text alone. We wouldn't learn any meaning if we don't as well are embedded in an exchange in the word. Why so? So I wrote a paper in the same volume as well, which is you can access open access in the internet. And there I made a distinction between what I call, with some linguists, cotext and context as a whole. So what is this weird word cotext, right? Cotexts are just the tokens and the numerical relationships in a text corpus, basically. So it's what large language models operate with. They have these tokens, and they know how the tokens relate to each other in a text corpus. Right? They have the mathematical relations of that. But that by itself, I would say, is not enough for understanding the word. There are some who argue it is, but I think it's not. And I've argued in another article, together with the psychiatrist, philosopher Thomas Fuchs, that there's something more that we need to make sense of text. So what is that more? If we look at a large language model, this is supposed to depict a large language model in that box. What does it get? It gets a prompt. You could put a prompt in. That's a text usually, or maybe you could speak into it, but that's transformed into text for the model, and it gives you a text output. It has been before trained, again, with text, even if that text represents videos, let's say. And all this text that it gets and that it operates with, in our view, is like a scaffold. A scaffold is something used in construction. You can use to build something. In this sense, it's a metaphor for building sense with language. So text is used for humans in language games, as we could say with Wittgenstein, to produce meaning. It's like we scaffold, use it to exchange or to do language games. It's used in language games to communicate, for instance, or to make sense of the word, or to write poetry. Right? But for the large language models, it just gets this cotext. So all of this basically is cotext. These relationships that are like a scaffold between tokens in a text corpus, that is all what I call cotext. Now, cotexts, these relations, they are important for us too, right? The text is important, but we make something more out of that text. How do we do so? Well, we put the text in its context. So cotext is only a small part of context. And really, when you write poetry, there's a lot of unsaid, right? But it's something that opens a space for us to make sense, not only of that what has been literally said, but also the surrounding. So all of this could be part of context, like the situation we're in. Also, cotext is part of context, but just a small part. There's also like what you anticipate, for instance, in the text from what you have read so far, or from your history, the culture and the setting in which this takes place, and all these other things, they are part of context. And I'd say that context is not just in you, nor in the author. It is a situation, an atmosphere, a part of the world we are in. Basically, you could say the word we share is the context of meaning. Now, often many people confuse context in the way of saying cotext with context as a whole. So often context is defined in terms of this narrow context or cotext, what I call cotext here. So I don't want to police language. I don't want to say it's necessarily wrong to speak just of cotext as context. People can do so, but we need to be careful what we follow from that. So for instance, the linguists Boleda and Herbelot, they say that context is the linguistic environment in which a word appears. So they talk about what I say is cotext. And by that self, if you want to define context like this, that's fine. But if you then say, well, this is all of context, then you're at the edge of a misunderstanding. And that is that large language models really do understand meaning, as the computational linguist Manning says, who wrote so intuitively about this example of the Chennai. And others do similar claims that large language models do something that amounts to understanding, and sometimes even that there are glimpses or inklings of artificial general intelligence, so an intelligence that could do everything a human could do, or that there are sparks of artificial general intelligence. And the idea is that there could be a little bit of meaning in that already. And of course, because the progress goes on, large language models would understand more and more meaning. But is this really the truth? Do they really understand any meaning? So when we go back to Derrida's saying, il n'y a pas de hors texte, there's nothing outside of the text. What did Derrida really mean with this? There's nothing outside. So Gunkel, together with Köckelberg in a newly released book on AI and large language models, they say that the saying there's no outside the text, in the party-context, the text, means exactly this, that large language models are operating with these texts in that meaning that Derrida suggests. But if you look into Derrida and see what he wrote later on this topic, then he clarified what he meant with there's nothing outside the text. And actually, he means there's nothing outside context. So Derrida very much is concerned with context as a whole. That is, meaning is embedded in this broader context. And this context is really what frames the meaning of a text. And for Derrida, it's everything there is we have to make sense of a text. Now, where does the author come in here? Where we could think of the author as a part of context as well. The author could be here and help us explaining a little bit about this. But if we think of the author and we ask with Foucault, what is an author? He says in the very last sentence of that essay, what difference does it make who is speaking? Well, we can ask, what difference does it make, right? So I have a text here on writing. Writing is a technology because like there's surfaces, papers, skins, paints, and so on. And by contrast, the text says, to natural oral speech, writing is completely artificial. So when I have this here on the slide, I'm a bit uncomfortable because I wouldn't agree to this. I mean, I would agree to some what's written here. I think that writing is a technology, but maybe that reason that we have pens and other surfaces to do writing, I mean, yeah, there are other technologies involved in writing too, but for me, technology is something more like related to the Greek word, techne. It's more something like a way of doing things. And for that reason, I do think writing is a technology. But I also think language is a technology. It's even a tool we use to communicate, for instance, or to make sense of the word, or even to think, right? Language itself is intertwined with human thought, our consciousness, our experience, our communication, interaction, sense-making, and of course it's very central for being an author. So I'm more comfortable putting quotation marks around this and writing who wrote this, right? And I think it makes a difference, at least for me, it makes a difference. And now if I say this is something that was cited at this workshop by David Ganke, who talked about this and who also rejected the idea that natural oral speech is completely natural, then this gives you more context. It gives you an idea of this discourse where we're engaging in. It gives you an idea of the meaning this has in our discourse. So all of this comes in for the author, or all of this is a part of what the author is. So I'd say all the context is somehow colored by the author in there. The context is not something that is like in the head of the author or in the mind of the reader. It is something in between author and reader. For large language models, there are many writers that are involved. They're just much harder to see, also because there are so many, right? Who are the writers in there? Well, the text corpus was written by authors throughout millennia. Everything we have digitized and which the companies who built the large language model decided to take up is part of the text corpus, an enormous knowledge. Large language models wouldn't work without all the authors that had written those texts. So that's part, this selection is part of that too. It's important what is included, what is not included. The design of the large language model, of course, is also important. How it was trained, how it is prompted makes a difference. Even the tokenization makes a difference. And also what you put into the prompt is not what the large language model gets straightforward. There's also what is called a system prompt, something in between. So this writing of the system prompt has also a big influence of the text you're getting out of the large language models. And then there is also a frame, an interface where you put in the text, and that also has to be developed. And the whole calculation that is done on that, it's also a method, a technology that had to be developed. And then before you get the output, there's also some post-processing that is part of what we call a large language model. So there's a lot of lots of decisions to be made here. There are lots of people working on this. There is also responsibility in here. There are authors, but they are pretty hidden. It's not the large language model as an author, but there are many people taking part of the output. A very different idea of how to produce a text. Now, with regard to human authors, what does that do to us as human authors? How does it change our way? What even makes up human authorship? Right? These are important questions. And I think Foucault has some good ideas on this in this very article I mentioned. So he thinks that there is something transdiscursive or discursive to different issues that he is talking about, where an author is more than a writer of a book. The author also founds a theory, a tradition, a discipline. The author, in my words, opens up a new context of meaning. And for Foucault, it's always important to go back to the origin, at least for a discourse like that, where there is a horizon of meaning opened by an author, and we have to try to understand what the author meant, not just make sense of the text, but also of the culture and the context in which the text was written, not to stick to that or not to say that is the ultimate meaning, but to make our own meaning out of the text. So if you look at authorship from this perspective, as something where authorship opens up a new discourse, way of making sense of issues, then I think we are closer to understanding why we need the context, and that author is part of that context, and the author frames the context, opens up the context, and gives us a new perspective. This is really what authorship accomplishes in this view. And this is something that goes much beyond co-text. It goes much beyond just like producing meaninglessly a text that others can make sense of. Right? There is an interrelationship between author and reader, which is important for this structure of sense making. So I've argued that large language models work on the level of co-text and not context. They have to be put in a wider context, and that co-text is not enough for authorships, and that authors create a new context and thereby open a new horizon of sense making which others can explore with going back to the author. So the author is not the ultimate authority, but it's an important way to make sense of the writing. So large language models, I think, they can be used in two ways. They can be used to produce, well, actually many ways, but two principal ways. They can be used to produce something that emulates like an author, but it's really something really different from authorship. But they can also support authorship. And I think that is important for us to realize how it can support genuine authorship. Not just producing as much text as possible, but to improve writing and to become a better writer, potentially, and help us engaging in a sense-making, in a wider discourse. That is really where language models should support us. And I think there are different ways in which they can do, either with researching or giving feedback, so to say, on our writing and some improvements, but that's something I'm happy to discuss, and I think we don't know all the possibilities yet. And of course, we must be very aware of the possibilities of misuse, which are now really prominent and dangerous and are threatening authorship and a lot of aspects of human life. Some of this I've talked about in an interview recently. There's a Greek translation if you're interested in this, but I'm also happy in discussing these things. We still have 15 minutes, I believe, for further discussions. So thank you very much for being here and you're listening.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the very insightful and thought-provoking talk and presentation. Μπορούμε να περάσουμε στις ερωτήσεις. Όποιος έχει κάποια ερώτηση, θα δίνω στο τέλος. Πολύ ωραία.
Θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω, αν δεν κατάλαβα καλά και θέλω να το διευκρινίσω, να μου διευκρινιστεί, όταν λέτε co-text, μπορούμε να πούμε ότι τα μεγάλα γλωσσικά μοντέλα είναι στο επίπεδο του context, ότι δεν έχουν context, ότι δεν μπορούν να έχουν πρόσβαση στο context. Κατάλαβα καλά?
Okay, sorry, I didn't completely hear this. So I think they only work with code text. And
ναι. Τα μεγάλα γλωσσικά μοντέλα. Μας δείξατε το co-text, αυτό που εσείς ονομάζετε co-text. Και ύστερα μιλήσατε για το context. Αν καταλαβαίνω καλά, αυτή είναι η ερώτηση, το μεγάλο γλωσσικό μοντέλο δεν έχει πρόσβαση στο context.
Yes, correct. Because well, it does have, you could say, it does have access to context in some mediated way. So you could, let's say, explain to the large language model what context there is. But you can do this only when you put the context into text again. And this is, the large language model again gets the context in the form of cotext. So there is only cotext for the large language model. It could explain some context, but only, of course, what you can put into text, and you cannot put all the context into text. Because then you would need to, again, explain the context of that further cotext that you put into the large language model ad infinitum. That is, you would get an infinite regress. You would never be able to put all the context into cotext.
Ναι. Δηλαδή, έχει πρόσβαση, μάλλον αφομοιώνει το context μέσα από το co-text που του βάζετε με το training text, ας πούμε.
Mm-hmm. Yes, through the text corpus and through the training you can teach the large language model the context, but it's only operating within this context. You need to put the large language model in a wider context to make it work for us. You need to have somebody who's prompting the model, and that's of course text we understand. You have somebody who reads the output of the model. Then we can embed the output into a new context again. So the context comes in kind of surreptitiously. We do not really realize that we are bringing in so much into the model's input and output, and we forget about all the authors in the model. But the model itself, it's so to say stupid. It just is a technological device that is just doing calculations. And those calculations, they can simulate certain forms of sense-making for humans, but by itself, there's no understanding in the model. There's no authorship in the model. There's no sense-making, and it doesn't open a new discourse of sense-making.
Όχι, προσωπικά νομίζω ότι αυτό που λέτε, αυτό που καταλαβαίνω τώρα...
Συγγνώμη, αν μπορούμε να έχουμε και ερωτήσεις.
Ναι, συγγνώμη.
Μπορώ εγώ. Θα ήθελα να κάνω μια ερώτηση σχετικά με τον συγγραφέα και με τον αναγνώστη. Μου άρεσε αυτή η σχέση και σκέφτηκα ότι ο συγγραφέας πριν γράψει είναι αναγνώστης. Και γίνεται αναγνώστης και του έργου του ενώ γράφει. Ο αναγνώστης βέβαια και δίνει ένα μήνυμα, ένα νόημα αποκτά με αυτά που γράφει, εκφράζοντας τον εαυτό του. Ο αναγνώστης πώς μπορεί να βοηθηθεί να βρει το νόημα του συγγραφέα, χρειάζεται να τον βοηθήσει, χρειάζεται να το έχει υπόψη του όταν γράφει ένα κείμενο για τον αναγνώστη. Αυτό. Ευχαριστώ.
We as authors, or we as a society, or we as like who use large language models?
Όταν λέω εμείς, ένας συγγραφέας που γράφει ένα βιβλίο για οποιοδήποτε θέμα και γράφει και οποιαδήποτε συνθήκη και να είναι αυτή, δίνει κάποιο μήνυμα προς το κοινό, προς τους αναγνώστες. Αυτό εννοώ. Αυτό το μήνυμα πώς εκμεύεται και πώς επεξεργάζεται από τον αναγνώστη, και αυτό πρέπει να το έχει πολύ σοβαρά υπόψη στο μυαλό του ο συγγραφέας όταν γράφει κάτι για τον αναγνώστη.
Thank you very much. That is a really good question. I think there are ways to help the readers for writers, but I don't think the writer can control all of the reading of the author's work. So what we can do, of course, is to be relatively clear in the writing. And I think their large language models can do some help if we use them right. But of course, if you write poetry, for instance, it's not that easy. I think if you keep in mind the broader discourse in which you're taking place and the style of your writing, and your origin, yourself, your reading, as you said, where you come from, and try to be aware of your writing as a whole, then this is probably the best you can do to help the readers understand what you wanted to write in the right way. So basically, be a good writer. Of course, one can also, like, say, give an interview to explain what you wanted to write, or you can write a response if there's like a reply, and they can clarify things. But I think this only goes so far. And as an author, I think we are always in the position that we somehow put the text into the world and we don't have control over it anymore. So this old idea of authorship as the authority of over the text, I think this is indeed like an old idea from the 17th, 18th century that we need to let go. And this is, I think, what already Barthes and also Foucault were thinking about at that time. So it's not something new. We had it before large language models, but now, of course, there are new threats coming through large language models, but also maybe new possibilities.
Μία-δύο ερωτήσεις και μετά σε απαντήσεις συνολικά για να μην ξεφύγω.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting speech. I would like to ask you, during the history of art, you know, we haven't, it has not been progressed step by step. That means that it was also explosions. For instance, Picasso with Cubism, it was an explosion. It was not based on what was drawing before. And also in the art of writing, the same thing. So do you think that LLM models in the future will help to have such explosions generally in art, or this coexistence of a writer and LLMs will be reduced and more predictable in the writing and everything?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's also a really good question. Okay.
You can answer that.
Okay, so I should answer fast, maybe. So I think what we see now, there's a lot of flattening, and this is what large language models are doing in all kinds of in writing, but also in music, in videos. It's all like unfortunate for all the users. We get a lot of slop that is like non-quality writing, superficial, and which would be better off without. But I also see some possibilities to use, and I think, artists have been synthesizing different styles, but I don't think a large language model can do that, because there we need a broader context. So Picasso was not just like putting together art like snippets he got from the past, but he also conceptualized them in a broader way. So he was interested in this broader context, and this is what allows you to do something really creative, something new, where something new comes. And I think large language model might support that, but they're not going to be doing it by themselves.
So, yeah. It's a little bit related. If I understand well what you said, so do you believe that AGI, artificial general intelligence, or super intelligence is not possible with LLMs because of the restrictions you are mentioned? That's the first question. And the second is there any possibility in your more philosophical understanding that this space for context is, let's say, broadened, or even there is, for example, now we can combine also sound, not just text, or image. So in a way, though the machine will never feel, but it seems to have more and more, let's say, parts of the context combined. So it's a large topic, but
Yeah, so I think this can lead to advances, combining video and audio and other data, but ultimately that's all data still. And for the large language models, it's just like relations between tokens. Maybe there are new kinds of tokens, not just the text tokens, but still, it's not going to lead to AGI, artificial general intelligence, because it doesn't get this whole context that is important for meaning. It doesn't have any meaning. And without meaning, I think you don't have authorship, and you don't have a mind either. So I think there's a lot of hype, and we need to be aware not to get drawn into that hype. And that get drawn into it could be in two ways. It could be by just believing the AIs are like replacing authors and they can do all an author could do, which is not true. But it could be also being afraid of large language models, like taking over authorship and being critical about it can also be a way of believing in the hype, but just having a different attitude to it, right? We should be sober and try to understand what kind of technology that is, where it can support, and where it's also, and I think there are also many ways in which it can go astray and endanger authorship or even like human mind.
Okay, one last question, Alexandra. And we'll have to...
Thank you for the way you have exposed the real problem of writing and its authorship. I feel that technology wants to share the authorship with the writer. When we say that writing is artificial, we ignore that the language is not separated from mind, consciousness, spirit. This is the relations expressed in the text, in the writing. So saying that writing is artificial, we only say that this is in the first, very elementary level. Otherwise, we must misunderstand. We think that artificial intelligence can be right. It's not true, isn't it?
Yes, I totally agree. Thank you.
Reduction. It is the reduction which is the problem.
It's a what?
The reduction.
Reduction, yes. Yes.
Of the writing merely to the language.
Yes.
Not to the relationship of language with conscience, mind.
Yes, for sense making and creativity and for opening up a new discourse, we need much more than just that kind of narrow sense of writing. And that is something where philosophy, I think, also becomes important to understand, well, what is really involved in writing, in text. Already the ancient Greek philosophers were thinking about it, not only philosophers, of course, 2,500 years ago. There was a very lively discussion about what is text, what is writing, and how does it change memory, but also knowledge, consciousness. They didn't have that word then, but basically they were concerned with writing as a technology impacting us as people in our mental activities. And I think they were right. So Plato wrote on that. Not everything, I think I agree and I disagree, but Plato opened a discourse which is very important for us still today. We just used writing for so many thousand years now that we're used to it, and we don't realize this is also technology that does a lot. But that's also for writers and authors. I think it's really important to know writing does something with our mind. It's fabulous. You can write a sentence and you put it out in the world, and it has so much more than what you associated with it. Right? You tip it like a gas pedal maybe, and the car moves. There's some magic to writing. But there's also danger that your work might be misinterpreted, or that you might not know the consequences of your writing, for instance. And it does change our interchange. And often I think it's important to keep a discourse going. And maybe there's a chance too in large language models that they show us, like for education, for instance. I'm a university teacher too, to do something more like they had with the Socratic dialogue, something more like an exchange, more of the development of everybody's thinking, rather than having like this objective text we can just read and consume and repeat and thereby believe that it could, that we would have understood. This is exactly the criticism Plato had. And I think their philosophy can tell us a lot about language, writing, and also these new technologies.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris, also for the very insightful answers. And it's always nice to end with some Plato.